of Center for South Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Dr. Jagannath Panda, Head, Stockholm Center for South Asian and Indo-Pacific Pacific Affairs. Dr. Prabir Day, Professor, Research and Information System for Developing Countries, New Delhi. Ms. Kadampini Sharma, Senior Editor, Foreign Affairs, NDTV. Yesterday was the inaugural session, which was followed by parallel sessions. With this brief recap of day 1 of the conference, let us begin the day 2 of this conference. We are honored to have amongst us eminent personalities who will bring with rich knowledge and diverse experience in the area of international relations. To take the discussion on India and Southeast Asia further and add another perspective to the saga of ideas, I would like to invite the privilege to introduce our esteemed speaker, Dr. Anusua Basu Ray Chaudhary. Dr. Anusua Basu Ray Chaudhary is a senior fellow with Observer Research Foundation's Neighborhood Initiative. She is the editor of ORF Bangla. She specializes in regional and sub-regional cooperation in South Asia, energy politics, forced migration, and women in conflict zones. She has been a visiting fellow at the Maison des Sciences, Paris. She has received the Kodikara Award for the Regional Center for Strategic Studies, Colombo, in 1988-99. She was also ICSSR postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Studies of Developing Societies, New Delhi. She is the editor of online journal IAAPS Perspectives and co-editor of peer-reviewed journal, Journal of Development Policy Review. She is also a member in the editorial board of journals, Borders in Globalization Review, published by Center for Global Studies, Canada, and Journal for Indian Ocean Research, published by Routledge, India. She has published several works and is a regular contributor to peer-reviewed journals, newspaper, magazines. Her latest work includes New Futures of BIMSTEC, Connectivity, Commerce and Security, and India-Myanmar Borderlands, Ethnicity, Security and Connectivity. May I request Dr. Anusua Basu Ray Chaudhary to kindly address the gathering.
Thank you so much, Niharika, for your modest introduction. Good morning, friends. I'm Anusua. I'm from Observer Research Foundation, Kolkata chapter, and I lead the entire research on proximity to connectivity from Kolkata, and our mandate is to looking at East of India as well as Southeast Asia and looking further for a wider Indo-Pacific and of course Australia, New Zealand and Japan. I think it's a great honor for me to participate in this discussion today, and at the very outset let me thank the organizers for engaging me in this discourse, and I'm sure I'll be enriched through our free and open discussion at the end of our session. I am from a public policy think tank. I think most of you know about Observer Research Foundation, Delhi. We do make or frame policies and recommendations for specific segments and issues. So in my brief presentation for next 20 or 30 minutes, what I would like to share is India's policy shifts or changes in India's foreign policy directives towards Southeast Asia. I'm not going into detailed discussion on the engagements and also the joint endeavors that have already been taken place between India and Southeast Asia. But my crux of focus will be on the policy shifts and what are the major reasons behind these policy shifts. So I have framed a very brief write-up, so let me share with you by reading it. Looking toward the East constitutes an important aspect of India's foreign policy since the 1990s, and henceforth India has been looking to the East and Southeast Asian neighbors to consolidate its age-old ties of friendship and mutual understanding. The initiation of the Look East policy and later refurbished as Act East policy is a harbinger of a positive approach in India's foreign policy paradigm towards Southeast Asia. But the fact remains here that the roots of India's Looking East policy or Act East policy can be traced to India's history and tradition dating as far back as the period preceding the Christian era. Against this backdrop, as I have already reiterated that in my presentation, I would like to focus on the trajectory of changes that actually took place and has been taken place in India's foreign policy paradigm. So let's start with brief historical backdrop. To contextualize the contemporary discourse of India and Southeast Asia, it is important to look at historical linkages between these two geographical regions. Since the time immemorial, Indians have had close trading connections with different regions of Southeast Asia. References to Southeast Asia appear in Indian literature very, very extensively as early as the 6th century BCE. In fact, the epic Ramayana also refers to Suvarna Deepa and Yavadipa, where Deepa means peninsular or island, and Suvarna means gold, and Yava means barley. Moreover, in the 3rd century BCE, King Ashoka also sent Buddhist missionaries to Subarna Bhumi, land of gold. In later period, we have seen the land routes through East Bengal, Assam, as well as Manipur, transported the Indians further to east. The Indians have traveled to Upper Burma through various passes in Manipur to reach different places of Southeast Asia and also to Lower Burma through Arakan. They also managed to reach places such as Malay, East Indies, and Indochina by crossing the Bay of Bengal. There are several theories to analyze, the influence of India in Southeast Asia, and also through the prism of political and cultural colonization of India, and also they named the entire process as Indianization. But we are not going into detailed discussion of these historical debates. But the fact remains that the signs of India's cultural influences evident in language, inscriptions, architectural remains, religious ideas, and other artistic forms. These are very extensive in nature. Of all the Southeast Asian nations, we know that Burma has also been regarded by the historians as one of the earliest places in Southeast Asia to have received Indian influence. Apart from Burma, of course, India and Siam, now presently it's Thailand, has reciprocal cultural connects since ancient times. So it is to be worth mentioning here that under the Mughals also we maintained a very good commercial ties and linkages between India and Southeast Asia through active and financial and active and functional relationship among the ports of these two regions. But during the colonial period, India was almost isolated from its neighboring friends. The historic bonds between the people of these two regions, however, did not stop each other. We can here also cite an example of Rabindranath Tagore, who is the first Nobel laureate from Asia. And his trip to Southeast Asia encompassing different countries like Singapore, Malay, Java, Borneo, Sumatra, and Indonesia, which he himself categorized as or identified as Bharat Yatra. It's also worth noting in this context that the British colonial rule in the region created a demand for English-educated people like Indian clerks, hospital dispensers, lawyers, merchants, teachers, and moneylenders who started settling in Southeast Asia and formed a small professional middle class, subsequently influencing the course of history of relationship between India and Southeast Asia. And we know today how important has become the role of diaspora in this region of South Asia, Indian diaspora in this region of South Asia. Now we are slowly entering to the new phase, that's a phase of decolonization. And we will see how the relationship between India and Southeast Asia went on during this particular phase. The process of decolonization set in motion after the Second World War, and subsequently the forces of globalization, liberalization provided new impetus to India's relationship with Southeast Asia. In the post-independence period, when a new power equation developed on the heels of Asia's emergence as a center of international power politics, this relationship between India and Southeast Asia, I think it is very important and also called for further investigation. The ideal of mutual understanding and cooperation was reflected in India's foreign policy in post-1947 period. We know that Jawaharlal Nehru, as the first Prime Minister of India, laid stress in the principle of Panchsheel, which is the principle of peaceful coexistence among all the, stakeholders and actors within Southeast Asia. And it has been approved in the meeting of Bandung, which took place in 1955. So in the phase between 1940s and the 1950s, India had a close rapport with Southeast Asian countries, while in 1960s, it's important to note, its engagement with Southeast Asian countries was gradually replaced by a period of isolation. A clash of ideologies and superpower dynamics kept the geographically contiguous region on opposite sides of the Cold War divide. It's worth citing here what Dr. Raja Mohan has specified in one of his articles, that the conflict with China over Tibet and the boundary tied down India so much to deal with countries within its own neighborhood during this phase. India's insular socialist policies resulted not just in India's relative economic decline, but also saw the erosion of historic trading links or commercial links with the neighboring regions in Southeast Asia. While India was preoccupied with the problems with China and Pakistan during these phase of 1960s and early 1970s, Southeast Asia was also going through turbulent phase with increasing communist insurgency within this region. Insecurity among the countries from the pro-Western camp of Southeast Asia heightened particularly in the 1960s with Britain's decision to withdraw from east of Suez, Nixon Doctrine of 1969, and also intra-regional conflicts within Southeast Asia. And as a matter of fact, the new development of regionalism, the urge to have an integrated effort to frame a regional bloc within the Southeast Asian region, it came up in the name of Association for Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, which was formed in the year 1969 because of Chinese threat perception. In fact, during the Cold War days, most of the Southeast Asian countries perceived India to be in the camp of the former Soviet Union. Apart from Vietnam to an extent, there was a very little political interaction. Strategic links were virtually non-existent, and economic bonds were of low importance. On the other hand, the intensification of the US involvement in Vietnam led to polarization with Southeast Asia. More so, in the aftermath of the oil shocks in the early 1970s, India's main concern was to secure uninterrupted oil supply to meet its increasing energy demand. Consequently, India tilted towards the West. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, India's attention was drawn again towards Southeast Asia, and the reason was China's attack on Vietnam, for the latter's military intervention in Cambodia in February 1979. India being a very close ally of Vietnam and being the only non-communist country which supported actually Vietnam on this particular issue. Therefore, the status of ASEAN dialogue partner granted to India in 1980, it was quietly withdrawn. Against the backdrop, India's revival in relations with the Southeast Asian neighbors was a result of two main factors. First, post-Cold War apprehensions about China's move towards Southeast Asia to fill the vacuum following the US withdrawal from the region. And second reason was the constraints of liberalized economy under increasing globalization impacts. So now we are entering another paradigm shift so far as India's policies towards Southeast Asia is concerned, that is post-1991 reforms and India's looking east. The collapse of former Soviet Union in 1991 resulted in the emergence of a new global political and economic scenario, which prompted paradigm shift in India's strategic world view, including the countries of Southeast Asia. To cope with the evolving global milieu, in July 1991, New Delhi, under the leadership of the then Prime Minister, Mr. P.V. Narasimha Rao, announced his new economic policy, which was guided more by economic imperatives and less by political rhetoric. At this juncture, I think it's also important to note that Indian foreign policy had, threefold objectives, specifically when we are entering a different, world of globalization. Threefold objectives. First one, to maintain the territorial integrity of India. Second, to ensure its geopolitical stability and security by creating durable environment of peace, security, and stability. And third one, which is also very, very, very important, is to build a framework for a well-being of well-being of people by encouraging healthy healthy external economic environment. So these are three major objectives why India actually had entered these new policy changes towards Southeast Asia. It is to be noted that India's Look East policy took off at the time when Southeast Asia, Asian countries started, heading towards West. So we faced a perfect synergy between India's looking East and Southeast Asian countries looking West efforts. India became a sectoral dialogue partner of the ASEAN in 1992, later full dialogue partner in 1995, and also a member of ASEAN Regional Forum in 1996. All kinds of engagements, initiatives, joint ventures were taking place during this phase. However, in these initial years, New Delhi had a very sluggish approach of economic reforms, mainly because of lack of stable governments in center. This is number one. And the number two is the 1997 financial crisis faced by ASEAN members. So mostly because of these two reasons, our approach towards Look East policy at the initial phase was not in a desirable pace. But fortunately, this lack of initiative of India was short-lived and didn't last long. The progression of better linkages with these countries, New Delhi took different initiatives. And we know that these initiatives came through the announcement, and this announcement came before a Look East policy second phase. We know that Look East policy has different phases, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And I'm sure, yesterday's conference and the sessions have already talked about these different phases and the implications of these phases. But one interesting aspect or the development that is taken place during this first phase is the realization to have, sub-regional cooperation. And that's why in 1997 we saw that BIMSTEC, the Bay of Bengal Multi-Sectoral Technical Economic Cooperation, it came up. And parallelly with this initiative, another initiative also taking place, that was the creation of Mekong-Gonga Cooperation in 2000 in Vietnam. So if we see that 1967, a kind of regional initiative took place within Southeast Asia, and if we look back to South Asian regionalism, then we will see that SAARC came up in 1985. So it's because of the offshoot of the second wave of regionalism that we faced, or the entire contiguous region faced during late 1970s, 1980s, different trade blocs came up in all over the world. So we also, had a kind of impact from this kind of regionalism. But this time, a new initiative, it came up in the name of sub-regional cooperation. In a nutshell, India's Look East policy crossed different phases, as I have already talked about. And after the first phase, the second phase, I think it started, in 2002, and the phase is between 2002 to 2011. And the third phase started since 2012. Lots of initiatives, adopted. And also interesting step, so far as ASEAN was concerned, has been the inclusion of Myanmar, and also inclusion of other less developed spaces or countries like Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam in the purview of ASEAN. It is also very interesting aspect for India's change in foreign policy directives. India and ASEAN in these phase signed many MOUs. I think what is very important here that the framework agreement on comprehensive economic cooperation, India's accession to the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia, following the trend of India-ASEAN cordial relationship. It can also be said that after 2012, the government of India continued to work towards what called the third phase of the enhanced Look East policy. Now we are entering again the interesting phase of Act East policy, and hoping towards having a new vista in India and Southeast Asia relations. With these development, a new refurbished approach towards more active engagement with Southeast Asia was adopted, and which was announced during India-ASEAN summit in Myanmar in November 2014. The foundation and objective of Look East policy remained the same, but the method of implementation, it has been changed, and more proactive measures have been taken to execute all the policies under 3 Cs. 3 Cs means commerce, culture, and connectivity. In this process of relinking the Southeast Asian countries, especially with Myanmar and Thailand, India's another important aspect is coming out, unfolding in this phase, is the importance of Northeastern region, India's Northeastern region, which has been regarded as a connecting space between east of South Asia and Southeast Asia. Therefore, the renewed emphasis on the Bay of Bengal region along the Southeast Asian contiguous zone has been a strategic shift to cater its national development on the one hand, and implementations of her Act East and Neighborhood First policies on the other. In fact, during this phase, we have seen how initiatives to build up India, Myanmar, Thailand trilateral highway and Kaladan multimodal transport projects have come up, and later New Delhi has a plan to extend India, Myanmar, Thailand trilateral. So it's people-to-people interaction. But the time when Indian government has realized the importance of diaspora and how diaspora can be engaged in the entire development cooperation between India and Southeast Asia. During this phase of connectivity, connectivity has become a buzzword, which is multifaceted and divided into several segments like physical, digital, commercial, oceanic, and people-to-people segments, and and so on. Desire to, during this phase, a desire to convert connectivity corridors to economic corridor. I'm sure Prabir has talked about this conversion of connectivity corridors to economic corridors, which are prevalent in Southeast Asia, especially the Mekong-Gonga region, about that. So there was a desire to convert these physical linkages, the connectivity linkages, to economic corridors of connectivity. And India has looked to partner with ASEAN in the master plan for ASEAN Connectivity 2025, ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework. Similarly, India and ASEAN have approved the Digital Work Plan 2022 in a plan in mind to connect all the important cities, while promoting broadband connectivity in Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. Parallelly, economic cooperation and trade efforts are going on, make the ASEAN-India free trade area most effective in facilitation in trade. With Indian, with Indian exports to ASEAN, it increased manifold during this particular phase, but there was a kind of apprehension what ASEAN actually perceived about India. In fact, it is very important to understand what others actually perceive, what others feel about India. Now, we have entered, and still we are entering, a very, very important segment, that is the segment that I usually call maritime, the phase where maritimes matter most. So at this particular juncture, we have witnessed a greater policy emphasis on maritime matters, translating significantly into diplomatic outreach in the neighborhood and into diplomatic in the neighborhood and in the wider Indian Ocean region. The belief and understanding that the country's locational advantage needs to be leveraged both in terms of developing maritime connections as well as the augmentation of security networks is now perhaps rooted more prominently, more firmly than ever before. And together with SAGAR, that's the acronym of initiative like Security and Growth for All in the region, that's SAGAR, the Maritime Vision 2030, which has become a kind of blueprint for maritime development and engagement of India with Southeast Asia. These are the latest, latest initiatives that are taken place with the scope of cooperative developments between India and Southeast Asia. In this particular phase, the concept of Indo-Pacific has been nurtured. India's notion of Indo-Pacific intertwined with ASEAN centrality. As you know that there is a difference between the connotation of, or the strategy of US construction of Indo-Pacific and India's construction towards Indo-Pacific. The important component of India's concept of Indo-Pacific and free and open Indian Ocean is ASEAN centrality. As a result, importance of Southeast Asia has increased manifold in recent times. The Bay of Bengal and its auxiliary, the Andaman Sea, is India's geopolitical and geostrategic gateway into the wider waters of Indo-Pacific. We can also cite, initiatives that Indian government has taken in the name of Indo-Pacific Oceans initiatives, and is expected to build on the shared vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific region with the pillars like maritime security, maritime ecology, maritime resources, capacity building, and resource sharing, disaster risk reduction and management, science and technology, and academic cooperation, and of course, people-to-people interaction. As a result, India-Southeast Asia engagement in general and India-ASEAN in particular in the maritime domain has been designed a key area of cooperation at present time. We have taken a couple of initiatives on this particular development paradigm frame. And of course, during this phase, India is also keen to enhance its relationship with Japan, with Australia, in these particular domains, especially on the line of free and open Indo-Pacific. Apart from bilateral engagements, India-ASEAN Maritime Transport Cooperation Agreement is being negotiated and finalized. And also, it's important that there are other important initiatives taken by India and Southeast Asia, say, for example, the coastal shipping arrangements. And if you want to know in detail, I'll come later in our discussion. Of course, both India and Southeast Asia, on the principle of commonality and shared prosperity, they also keep pondering upon blue economy, different aspects related to blue economy. So ASEAN-India Blue Economy Framework announced in 2018. The promotion of tourism and people-to-people linkages is another priority engagement area. At a connectivity summit in 2017, Indian officials, unveiled plans to boost cruise tourism from 80 ships per year to 900 ships to enhance people-to-people connection. Well, while dealing with all these developments, concerning India and Southeast Asia in recent past, it is imperative to mention that, like other parts of the world, the unprecedented pandemic COVID-19 has impacted both the region's economy, affecting manufacturing chains, manufacturing supply chains, and the movement of people and goods. China's new approach of engagement with the Southeast Asian countries through vaccine diplomacy during this COVID-19 period, COVID-19-induced health crisis situation, has got international attention. Experts have argued that as China has been facing resistance from different parts of Southeast Asia, so China actually intends to change its policy of engagement or assertion in Southeast Asia. Both India and Southeast Asia have been keen to strengthen partnership in the post-COVID phase by highlighting 5 areas under the acronyms like SHARE. SHARE, what does it mean? SHARE means supply chain, health, academics, regional approach, and environment. In fact, both the regions have also decided to strengthen human security, oriented all dimensions, especially public health cooperation, as well as research and development in environment. Well, while concluding, I would like to say that the first changing geostrategic and geoeconomic forces have shaped the connections between India and Southeast Asia. The historical linkages or histories of cultural linkages along with the physical capital related to connectivity have thrived in the region. The region of the Bay of Bengal along with Southeast Asia has seen the reincarnation of Quad as a new formation of Quad Plus with the participation of several other stakeholders like New Zealand, South Korea, and Vietnam. There are other initiatives that are coming up like Blue.net with the stakeholders involving like Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Australia, and UK. India is also, as I have already reiterated, taking initiatives so far as free and open Indo-Pacific is concerned, keeping the importance of sea lens of communications, because you know the geographically the entire region, Bay of Bengal, along with the auxiliary Andaman Sea, is a hub for commercial activities. So free and seamless navigation has become very, very important for all the stakeholders. So SLOCs have become very important in this regard. But I would end by posing a few questions before you for further discussion. Is absence of any Southeast Asian countries in the new construction of FOIP causing serious concern? This is number one, a question that I want to pose for discussion. Second, does Southeast Asia tend to associate the FOIP, which means free and open Indo-Pacific, and Quad? Third, what is its stance on the recently formulated AUKUS that we know that UK is showing its interest in this region, because it's basically the resources, the resource politics has become very, very important so far as Bay of Bengal is concerned. And the last question is, how we interpret Southeast Asia's perception towards India, because it's very important to understand Southeast Asia's perception. Otherwise, what we are getting, ideas or getting impressions from all the Southeast Asian countries, because as a researcher, I've been traveling all these places, and when we ask about India, they are saying that yes, we have a historical linkages. We are very prompt in framing policies, but we are lagging behind so far as the execution of policies are concerned. So we have to think of it to overcome this lacuna and to implement our over-enthusiastic stand towards Southeast Asia. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Ajshua Basure Chaudhary, for highlighting India's foreign policy of Southeast Asia, also for tracing the roots through India's history, the role of colonization, the role of Indian diaspora in Southeast Asia, and also for bringing in the context of decolonization and globalization. You also highlighted the impact of COVID-19 pandemic or India-South Asia relationships. And also you left us by posing certain questions to ponder upon. Thank you so much, ma'am. With this, I would like to invite our next delegate. So as we build up our understanding on the relationship between India and Southeast Asia in contemporary times, I would like to take the opportunity to invite an illustrious speaker with a great experience in security and development policy. Dr. Yoji Natori, Dr. Yoji Natori is an associate professor of International Liberal Arts Global Studies program at the Akita International University, Japan. Dr. Yoji holds a PhD in land resources from the University of Wisconsin, Madison, United States. He has served as a manager, Science to Action at the Conservation International Japan, a researcher at the Ecosystem Conservation Society Japan, a researcher at the Japan Wildlife Research Center, JWRC, an assistant to the Chief of International Section, Wildlife Division at the Ministry of Environment, Japan, a vice chair at the Japan Committee for International Union for Conservation of Nature, a biodiversity expert in the technical support team to a proposed JICA yen loan project in the Himachal Pradesh state of India, and a member of the local ESG financing committee at the Ministry of Environment, Japan. I humbly invite Dr. Yoji Natori, who has traveled from Japan to attend this conference and to be amongst us, to share his view on the point of convergences and divergences between India and Southeast Asia.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm truly honored to be here. I'd like to thank organizers for inviting me and bringing me here from all the way from Japan in the middle of the semester. And I'd like to thank technicians for making laptops available for me to make a presentation. I usually use slides and I cannot talk without slides, so it's really nice to have slides at my fingertip. And I also like to thank a student aide who made my stay as comfortable as possible, and particularly Mahida, thank you very much for your support. And I had a campus tour yesterday, and I observed a lot of sustainability efforts that's going on campus, starting from recycling bins and water dispensers across the buildings, and also no plastic on the table. That's really wonderful, and I think it's really important as a student to learn and engrave that thinking in your mind in the early stage of your development. Okay, so with that, I'd like to start my talk. And I've been hearing the keynote speeches since yesterday, and I'm pretty sure that this is not the kind of conference I usually attend, but I've been exposed to a new field, and I'm thinking that with that background, I think my presentation now will make more sense. Okay, so I was thinking how to start this presentation, this talk, and I couldn't think of any better place to start than this logo. This is a logo that Indian government created for the Conference of the Parties, 11th Conference of the Parties to the Convention of Biological Diversity, exactly 10 years ago this week in Hyderabad. As you can see, there's tiger and dolphin surrounding people practicing livelihood activities. And message, that slogan was nature protects if she's protected. And that's very nicely put, concise message that really hit at the essence of environmental issues. Okay, so environmental problems, put simply, I say it's externalities. If you're an economist, you know this word. Externalities are the costs and benefits that happens to someone or somewhere outside of the consideration of parties making decisions. A lot of environmental issues, I would say all environmental issues happen this way because they are treated as externalities. Okay, and I'd like to express that what I'm talking with this cartoon. Since I'm from Japan, maybe you're expecting something like this. So I had this idea and asked my wife to draw it, and my daughter joined and added a few elements to this. So this is what environmental issues are discussed and addressed in the world. So as you can see, there's, oops, this one, big hole in the bottom of the ship. So water is coming in. We need to do something immediately. But there are people here representing countries, basically, pointing fingers at each other and saying, this is your fault. You step on a weak spot, and you didn't do the proper management, and so on and so forth. So they are pointing fingers at each other, blaming each other, not taking action to address the issue directly. And there are some people here, I won't do anything until you do. So like a typical picture is a developing countries blaming on developed countries. You do something first. And unless you do, we don't do anything. That was a typical conversation close to 10 years ago about climate change. And then there are further people, other countries, try to take advantage of this confusion to make profit. And while that's happening downstairs, upstairs, there are people, there are countries, there are a group of organizations fighting each other to create a whole new problem on the same ship. And there are person here try to fix the problem, but if he's not careful, he may be creating another problem on the same ship, maybe tearing apart the wall of the ship to fix the hole here without noticing making problem here. Okay, so this is, simply put, the discussions all around the world taking place when we talk about economic development, social development in countries or international platforms. And it's very important to have a site that's one scale larger. I'm trained as landscape ecologist, and landscape ecologists think the world in 3 scales. And the scale that you're working in, and the one scale up that set the framework, the frame of the things that you're interested in, and one scale below that provides mechanisms. So one scale up, if you look like you are watching this cartoon, you see that ship is sinking because there's a hole in the bottom of the ship. But these people may not understand the issue like that. So all these activities that's taking place on the ship, although they may be legitimate for those engaging in those activities, but they are nothing as the entire ship is sinking. Okay, so impact on others are not considered on decision making of those people, and so that's again externality issues. And the ship is sinking. The consequence, maybe everyone will be drowned or eaten by sharks. According to my daughter, this is sharks. Okay. Right. So I often use this slide, graph to talk about the development and environmental sustainability. Okay, so on this is done by ecological footprint network, and on x-axis, they're plotting human development index. It's indicator of societal development, considering education, food security, job opportunities, and so on. So it's an indicator, so it's not perfect, but it's a good surrogate to our understanding. So as development progresses, countries, each dots represent countries in the world, countries move from left to right. So more development, more higher quality of life, that's movement to the right. And on y-axis here, this is an environmental impact. Okay, the higher you go, you have higher environmental impact. And the number here is representing number of planet. Okay? Each dot represents a country, and the way you understand this is that if everyone in the world lived like average person in particular country, how many planets do we need to supply the resources that they need? Okay? So these are some of the countries that I picked up. For example, like US, if everyone in the world lived like average American, how many planet Earth do we need? We need 5 planets. Japan, where I'm from, if everyone in the world lived like average Japanese, we will need about 3 planets. Russia, about the same. China, about 2 planets. Okay, we all know that we only have 1 planet. So what does 5 planet means in the case of US? It's basically overusing natural resources, taking resources from future generations, using it for the benefit of current generations. If you talk about future generations, it might sound like someone else's problem, but it's basically your generation, your future is being used probably in a wasteful way by these countries. Okay? And India is this dot. And the one feature you see here is that as you move from left to right, all the countries go up on this chart. So as the development goes, progresses, as the quality of life increases in the country, their environmental impact increases. That's traditional development path. So this upward movement is one trend. And another trend that you see is a concentration of same colors. Different colors represent different regions in the world. Yellow represent African countries. Blue represent European countries. Darker blue is EU countries. Okay, so EU countries located here, even though there are some differences, they are generally high development and high environmental impact, and sort of to some degree of uniformity within this group. ASEAN region, as we've been hearing from yesterday, maybe you've been talking about it much longer, but I've been hearing that since yesterday. ASEAN countries here. So maybe at the high end, it's about the same as European countries, but at the low end, it's highly, it's very divergent in this. There are significant amount of differences among the countries. So probably EU, it's not, I'm not saying it's simple, but in EU, uniform development strategy might work, but ASEAN and India, the uniform one development model will not fit. Okay, so what we need to do for sustainability, we need to have a development model that does this, bringing the country in the left to the right without deflecting to upwards. And another model that we need is bringing these countries that's high in this chart down without deflecting to the left. And both are very difficult problem, but I think the bigger challenge and what we need to work on is this arrow. We know how to bring these countries to the left, no, to the right. That's a traditional development path. We know how to develop a country. But how can we do this without pushing those countries up in this chart? So that's the downward arrow here. And carbon neutrality, halting biodiversity loss, resource efficiency, circular economy, all that is one part of the solution. Try to make this downward arrow possible. Okay, and I didn't get the animation right. It shouldn't be here yet. So this is 3 pillars of sustainable development, as many of you are familiar. Environment, society, economy. And the intersection of the 3 is sustainable development. That's often talked about that way. This Mickey Mouse structure have that message, but if you look at this, you may get the impression that there can be an environment, it can be a society outside of the environment, it can be an economy outside of the society. It's a competing interest. And the intersection that happen to be overlap of these 3 pillars is sustainable development. So you might think of sustainable development as a special form of development. That led to all sorts of environmental problems, or global environmental issues. So what we need to think about sustainable development is this. So there's economy completely within the bounds of the society, and the society completely within the bounds of, if this works, of the environment. Okay, so it's, instead of competing circle, overlapping circles, it's concentric circles. And this entire picture is sustainable development. It's not the special case of development. That all development has to be like sustainable in order to have like a global sustainable development. Okay, and this right-hand side picture, look from the top or look from the side, it looks like this. The Sustainable Development Goals has structure. It's not 17 goals on the same level on the table, but there's a structure. At the bottom, that's underpinning all the society and economy is a natural environment, biosphere. On top of that is society. On top of that, economy. So unless you have sound environment, you cannot expect to have good society. Without a good society, you cannot have good economy. So it goes from bottom to up. But also, it's true that it comes from top to down. You have a thriving economy, you tend to have, can support good order in the society. Good society can take care of the natural environment well. So it goes from bottom to up, also from top to bottom. The point here is that there is structure in sustainable development. You cannot pick one, your favorite goal, and work on that, and think that you can achieve that goal. It's all interlinked. So in order to address sustainable development goals, SDGs, you need to address the entirety. And having understanding of these structures and interlinkages is really important to have sustainable world. And this diagram is made very famous in the conservation community. I'm not sure if any of you have seen this, but it's known as the wedding cake structure because of the shape. This was developed by 2 researchers, Johan Rockström from Stockholm Resilience Center back then, and Indian economist, Pavan Sukhdev. And he was very enthusiastic putting this idea in people's mind. It's environment is not a separate issue from economy and society. It's all part of the big picture. Right, so that's the concept. That's where we need to go. Where we are now is sort of grim, serious. So we have vicious cycle of environmental degradation. Okay, so we have agriculture and urban areas expanding, encroaching into natural environment. And we have issue of overexploitation of natural resources. And all around the world, we have a problem of alien species, invasive alien species, like lantana species in India. Indian foresters fighting really hard against that species, the exotic species, but it is really hard work. And greenhouse gas emissions causing, it's emitted from our daily lives. and it's causing the big problem, which is these. So all these factors in pink box causing reduction in biodiversity that leads to reduced resilience in natural systems. Also, it leads to social insecurity and international insecurity too. And climate change, as you all know, is happening. And that leads to increased disasters, increased natural disasters and natural catastrophes. And frequencies and intensity of those is increasing. And wildlife species is shifting its location, it is shifting their habitat because the previous habitat is not suitable for them to live anymore. And that's also happening to human population as well. So this is the feedback loop that's happening in the environment field, environment arena. But this is made worse or accelerated by socioeconomic factors. Population growth, the human population growth is exponentially growing, and globalization of trade and people's movement is particularly causing issue of alien species. Economic greed on one hand, rich countries try to be richer, rich people try to be richer without considering rest of the world, rest of the population. So that's happening on one hand. And on the other hand, it's poverty issues. The poor people stay poor, and they cannot think of environment. They cannot think of tomorrow, today. They think of tomorrow, tomorrow. So they are not in the position to use natural resources or environment in a sustainable manner. We need to get people out of the poverty conditions in order to have good effort, good movement, pushing forward for the environmental sustainability. Okay, and it's not just socioeconomic factors influencing the environment, but also there's a feedback from environment to the socioeconomic factors. So environment is degrading, so there is a negative feedback, negative impact on the societal development, economic development. So that, again, it's all linked. And state of the environment, a little bit of a few examples. Extinction, to just give you the sense of how serious this is now. In the history of the planet, 4.6 billion year history of the planet Earth, there has been 5 mass extinction episodes. And the last one is 65 million years ago when dinosaurs went extinct. So have that in your mind and look at the next message. Scientists are convinced, and there's a growing number of scientists in saying that we are currently in the 6th mass extinction episodes. So the rate of extinction that we are observing now is as fast as the time when the dinosaur went extinct. So dinosaurs didn't go extinct because of their own action, but this time we are degrading, destroying our environment. We are undermining our own existence. So are we really smart species? Can we say we are smarter than a dinosaur who had like 60 grams of brain? Okay, so this is as serious as it is in the perspective of species extinction, biodiversity perspective. Just one example. We know what is causing this. And this is all human activities, the habitat loss, invasive species, human population pressures, pollution, climate change, overexploitation of resources. And all that is caused by the inability of market to address these issues, market failures, incorrect price signals, and unaccounted externalities. Okay, so 2010, countries in the world, 193 or so countries, so basically all countries in the world except the US, got together and agreed on the target to be achieved by 2020. So 10-year plan known as Aichi biodiversity targets. Those are biodiversity targets, but if you look at it closely afterwards, you will know that this is really a sustainable development targets. after 10 years, what was the outcome? So countries in the world addressed these issues for 10 years, and none of these 20 targets were achieved in full. There are some advancement that's indicated by green or blue. What we wanted to see is all green, all blue on all these 20 targets. But you see yellows and reds. So it's basically insufficient progress or no progress. So environmental targets were established, agreed, everyone by consensus adopted Aichi biodiversity targets, but in the end, it was not achieved. So what is the point of global targets? Okay, and currently, as of now, as I speak, they are negotiating next set of targets for 2030. It's called the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. That is hopefully be adopted in December this year. So there will be a new set of biodiversity targets so that countries can move quickly and strongly to address the biodiversity issues. Okay, so this is the concept that we want to have. Okay, so nature positive. We need to halt the loss of biodiversity and recover the environment, recover the biodiversity so that we can expect to have thriving societies, thriving planet in 2050. Okay, and climate change is happening, as you all know, but this video shows that very clearly, starting from an industrial revolution 150 years ago and moving it to the present. And blue is cooler than average, red is hotter than average of 1950s, 1980s. And currently year 2000 and moving on to 2018. As you can see, the northern hemisphere is all red or yellow. That's 1 to 2 degrees warmer than average. So climate change is happening. And in response to that, world countries agreed on Paris Agreement, okay, in 2015. And all countries in the world, big and small, developing, all countries in the world is part of the Paris Agreement to try to address these serious global issues. Science is very clear. What we need to do, we need to cut the carbon emission, global carbon emission, by half by 2030, and bring that emission to net zero by 2050. By net zero, they mean whatever we emit, we absorb by some other means, so that in effect, there is no emission. So this is a big challenge. All the major developed countries pledge to achieve minus 45% by 2030. There's a pledge there, action need to follow. But it's not just developed countries, but all developing countries, all the rest of the world has to reduce their emissions so that we can cut the global emission by half. So it's a big challenge that we need to address. If this were 3 years ago, I would have stopped at this point, but I need to add this point. I think this will bring the environmental issues closer to everyone's attention. Human ecological disruption and human health risks are very tightly linked. So Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, produced this very concise workshop report highlighting this linkage. There's biodiversity, which include viruses, that's harmful aspect to the human health. But it's part of the biodiversity, and it's not a bad thing. It's all wrapped, all kept in balance, and kept in balance of nature. So unless we disturb nature, we don't unleash those risky viruses. But if we disturb nature, there is a consequence. And as I'm underlining here, the underlying cause of pandemics are the same global environmental changes that drive biodiversity loss and climate change. So it's not just environment that we are destroying, but we are destroying ourselves, we are undermining ourselves. And so that you can convince yourself, there's some statistics here. The most of emerging diseases and almost all known pandemics are zoonoses. It originates from wildlife, hop to the human population, and spread around human population. So it's all wildlife origin. Okay, and more than 5 new diseases emerging in people every year. Okay, and 30% of emerging infectious disease are attributed to land use, agriculture expansion, urbanization. Okay, and unsustainable exploitation of the environment has led to almost all pandemics that we know. So that's the consequence of human mismanagement of the environment. But at the same time, nature is providing solution to us. 75% of approved antimicrobial drugs are derived from nature, natural, and naturally derived compounds. We are probably dismissing this opportunity by destroying the environment before we know the benefit of it. So environmental destruction, human health risks, very tightly linked. So it's not just the environment, the tree huggers' interest, but everyone's interest to protect the environment. Okay, so with that as a background, look at the world and look at this region. It's mapping exercise called the biodiversity hotspots. This is a mapping of the area in the world that's high in biodiversity, but at the same time under threat. There are 36 of them identified in India here and Southeast Asia. That's all very rich in biodiversity wealth, but it's all under threat, so it's covered with biodiversity hotspots. India particularly is diverse, covering, it hosts 4 biodiversity hotspots. No other countries in the world has 5 biodiversity hotspots. And ASEAN region is also entirely biodiversity hotspots. The management of environment there is very critical for the conservation of biodiversity in the global sense. And there's a lot, and there's rich environment, but there's a lot of people living there in harmony with the natural environment. So this is the photo from Northeast India, shifting cultivation as their traditional sustainable way of cultivating land. And also they have traditional knowledge, what can be eaten, what cannot be. So insects, plants, the traditional knowledge is really rich and important for and it may have a solution to our sustainability challenge in the future. Not just in India, but there's a similar case in Thailand. And other countries too. And I guess it's saying its time is up. But I'd like to touch on this. It's time for this paradigm shift. Is conservation a constraint to economic growth or a way to inspire creativity? In a traditional development, was thinking the former, the conservation, nature conservation, paying attention to environment, spending resources on environmental conservation was obstacle to economic development. But now there's a growing interest about the latter. So a lot of companies now thinking environmental sustainability, conservation as an inspiration, source of inspiration for innovation. And there are many companies now demanding parties that's negotiating next set of biodiversity, global biodiversity targets, to have like ambitious, high targets so that everyone, all the businesses in the world is headed towards the same goal of environmental sustainability. So demanding countries, demanding states to come up, agree, accept the ambitious targets so that they can perform better. So there's a fundamental shift in business thinking happening. Okay, so we need to decouple the typical thinking, environmental degradation, economic growth. We need to decouple that, and we need to create a new coupling, environmental development and environmental prosperity. Okay, so the finger pointing, manipulation of data to make others look bad, to make yourself better than you are, and those efforts, those arguments are not helping. Okay? Doing so is not getting the problem right. We are on this spaceship Earth. We are all in it together, and that ship is sinking. So we all need to change and act. So it all comes down to this simple question. If we cannot protect our only planet, will anything else matter? With that, I'd like to end my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Dr. Yoji Nitori has keenly emphasized on global environmental problems, making development a sustainable one, the vicious cycle of environmental degradation, mass extinction episode, human ecological disruptions, and human health risks. Also, he mentioned the decoupling and new coupling. Thank you so much, sir. It has been a multidimensional approach to the understanding of India and Southeast Asia in a changing world, Convergences and Divergences, by Dr. Anushua Basure Chaudhary and Dr. Yoji Nitori. I'm sure the discussions of our eminent speakers has ignited minds, kindled thoughts, and raised questions for which our audience would like to seek answers from the experts. Therefore, we will now open the floor for questions and answers. I request the volunteers to kindly support the participant with microphone. So you can raise your hands and the volunteers will reach to you.
Hello, good morning, and thank you both the presenters for the amazing presentation. And I have my question is for Dr. Anshua, that as you have said that during the formation of Quad and among the ASEAN members, we always find, so far the literature says us, that the dilemma is still prevailing among the Southeast Asian countries, especially regarding the formation of the Quad, and how far ASEAN centrality is visible in the further Indo-Pacific strategy, and what would be the role of India and how India should manage it in this case. So can you please put light on it? Thank you.
No, you can answer. We'll take the next question.
Thank you so much, Devnath, for raising this question. If I understood you correctly, you are basically intended to know India's strategy or policies towards Indo-Pacific against the backdrop of formation of Quad. Am I right? And
yes, ma'am, you are right. But
yes.
Just offshoot of my question is that whether ASEAN countries are okay with the formation of the Quad in real.
Right.
If we take the,
yes.
further formations.
Right. That's also precisely my apprehension. Um, and I can tell you from my own experiences while I was visiting, Thailand, Myanmar, Singapore, and Indonesia. And we posed this question to understand how these Southeast Asian countries actually perceive the entire construction of free and open Indo-Pacific. We know that ASEAN has its own development to identify Indo-Pacific. But, within this, their framing of Indo-Pacific, definitely it surrounds around ASEAN centrality, so as India's construction of Indo-Pacific. But at the very outset, I think it is to be kept in mind that all these strategies or all these initiatives are at this moment are strategic alliances. There is no as such governance structure as we have in the sense of ASEAN or in the sense of SAARC or any other regional bloc. So these are developing strategic alliances on the basis of some cases to cases, some issues to issues. So say, for example, the connectivity segment, India, Japan, they are very active, so far as implementation of the connectivity projects are concerned. Japan is heavily investing in the development of northeastern region, which I have spoken about Northeast India as a strategic linking space between South Asia and Southeast Asia. But at the same time, Australia is also very keen, so far as Dr. Natori has talked about the sustainable development goals. And that's why, the entire DFAT and the foreign affairs, agencies in Australia, they are keen to have India's partnership in a sustainable development agenda. And they have started expanding their wings in development and research, so far as illegal fishing, marine plastics, concerns related to marine plastic, illegal fishing, and disaster management, marine accidents, wrecks, all these segments are concerned. And India is also showing to have this kind of, approaches and initiatives with Australia. But come back to your main question, how ASEAN countries are perceiving about Quad. They are quite apprehensive. It's like, simply within your neighborhood or within your locality, some development is coming up without engaging you. How do you feel about that? It's like that. When we pose this question to Singapore or to Indonesia, because we know that Singapore is playing very important role because the the connecting linkages through Malacca Straits, Singapore is playing important role, so as Malaysia and Indonesia, because the entire governance of maritime security along this Malacca Strait, it's done by Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. So when we pose this question to Singapore, of course, the MOFA, the representatives, they started laughing and said that the same anecdote that I put it across, that look, madam, if anything is coming up in your neighborhood without engaging you, how do you feel about that? So a kind of perception of apprehension is prevailing. But in latest example, as I have talked about the inclusion of certain important stakeholders within Quad Plus Vietnam, it has slightly changed the connotation. But we know that why Vietnam has been included, why South Korea has been included, and New Zealand included within this parameter. But again, it's too early to say anything on Quad, because Quad Plus only takes shape during COVID-19 to take care of health crisis issue. Yes, thank you, Devnat.
Thank you, ma'am.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jimmal Rathore from third year in Bachelor's of Arts in Psychology, Sociology, and English. As I've studied social problems in sociology this year, I wanted to ask Dr. Yogi on your take about how meat consumption is a major contributor to climate change and how that is not very often discussed. And do you think, if you believe in that notion that meat is a contributor to climate change, do you believe that veganism and becoming a vegetarian will help, or do you think there are alternatives? And if you do not believe in it, what are your take? Like, what is your perspective, basically?
Thank you very much for that question. I discussed that very question with my students too. And meat consumption has very huge environmental footprint, especially beef, and that's on one fact. And as development progresses, more and more meat-eating diet increases globally. So the meat consumption is going as fast as population growth. And that has profound environmental impact. The tropical regions, deforestation, 80% of deforestation is said to be caused by expansion of agriculture. And that agriculture is mainly to feed livestock. So meat consumption and increase of it is really big environmental threat. And vegetarian diet, I think, can help. But that alone will not solve the problem. And then we have the issue of food loss, food waste. FAO estimate is that about a third of all food that's produced in the world, it gets wasted. It's not used. So making use of the wasted food resource is really high priority issue. There's one side of the world dumping food because they cannot consume enough. There's another part of the world starving. So having a good network of distribution can solve part of the food shortage issues and also help the dietary disease issues too. Vegetarian, having interest about vegetarian vegetable-based diet can help. It may not be very easy for everyone to move from meat eating to total vegetarian, but maybe one day a week, no meat day. Something like that can be started, and it can start causing a positive spin on the issues with the diet and the environment.
Thank you, sir. We can have one last question.
Good morning, both Dr. Natori and Dr. Basurai Chaudhary. It was really nice listening to both of you. My name is Omlan Ray. I'm a faculty and dean at Sri Sharda Institute of Indian Management. I teach international business. My question is for Dr. Basurai Chaudhary. We know that in 2012, there was initiation of a regional comprehensive economic partnership, and it is led by ASEAN, and it was also referred as ASEAN +6 due to centrality of ASEAN countries. So India repeatedly said its commitment towards RCEP, but finally had to withdraw in 2019. So would it have any impact on India's economic relationship with ASEAN countries in particular?
Thank you for raising this question. I think you are the best person to answer this question. But from political economic perspective, because I belong to international relations and political science backdrop, I think from ASEAN point of view, it was a major setback because ASEAN wanted India in this particular understanding, but India has its own dynamics why India didn't want to go for RCEP. to enhance its own domestic production, domestic manufacturing. But I think you have correctly pointed out it was a great initiative from ASEAN's and ASEAN Plus seeks to involve other stakeholders in the entire comprehensive economic framework. But India was not, initially India showed its interest in it, but afterwards India decided not to participate in RCEP, and which definitely had a setback for the ASEAN countries. When we raised this issue while during our field trip in relation to our main project, proximity to connectivity, they said that, India is in two minds what to do. It's their perception. India takes, India is keen to produce policies, but in case of implementation, they are in dilemmas. But when we spoke to Indian government officials on this particular point of RCEP, they are saying that our domestic field is much more important for us than joining the broader economic forum. But this is only from the political economic perception or political economic point of view, but definitely from economic perspectives, you may have certain other elements to discuss this particular stand for India.
Thank you, ma'am. Due to time constraint, we cannot have any more questions. You can have further discussions with both our dignitaries later. May I now request Dr. Philip to felicitate our dignitary, Dr. Basu Ray Chaudhary, with a memento. Thank you. I request Dr. Shalini to felicitate Dr. Yoji Natori with a memento. Thank you so much. As we come to the close of this session, I am reminded of a few lines by Edward Irwin. Coming together is a beginning, keeping together is progress, working together is success. I feel that these lines beautifully sum up the sessions which we had. On that note, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to all our speakers for the day for such an enriching exchange of ideas. I would take this opportunity to thank the audience for their questions, curiosity, and patience. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we would like to wrap up this session. Thank you so much. I have few announcements to make. The next session, that is the parallel session, would commence at 11:30 a.m. at the respective venues. The volunteers will guide you. Tea is served in the corridor just outside the auditorium. So unlike yesterday, it is not in the basement, but in the same corridor as the auditorium. Everyone is requested to join us back for the valedictory session in the auditorium, which will commence at 2 p.m. Thank you so much. I would request the students and participants to remain seated till our dignitaries leave. Thank you.